Good afternoon. Welcome to our Bible study on our very first Lenten Wednesday on February 24th, 2021. I'm holding this in the main church just so I can accommodate people who are in person, and it transitions and moves pretty well from our worship that begins at 12:05. So although we are not having things that are scheduled formally or in person in the evening, by providing this online and then loading it to YouTube, as of course what's left on Facebook, people are able to watch this when it is convenient for their schedule. So my hope is that people, as you're home from work tonight or wherever you've been during the day, that you're watching this now, you're able to worship and then have some time of study. My goal is to keep it about a half an hour, no more than that, maybe a little bit more. But for those of you who are not familiar with the way the Bible study works, there is a document that is found on Facebook Live and our webpage so that you can open it up. It's a 3-page document that has an introduction and the readings for this Sunday, as well as just a few things to reflect on. I like to study the lessons leading into the upcoming Sunday because it just provides a really nice way to dig more deeply into what it is that we're reading and hearing on Sunday morning. So I think that's all the housekeeping news. Thank you again for being a part of this, and what an amazing year this has been for all. So for the second Sunday in Lent, which is what we're going to be studying today, the second covenant in this year's Lenten readings is one made with Abraham and Sarah, God's promise to make them the ancestors of many, with whom God will remain in everlasting covenant. Paul says this promise comes to all who share Abraham's faith in the God who brings life into being where there was no life. We receive this baptismal promise of the resurrection life in faith. Sarah and Abraham receive new names as a sign of the covenant, and we too get new identities in baptism as we put on Christ. So you'll see that our readings are from Genesis chapter 17, the first reading, Psalm 22, Romans chapter 4, and Mark 8. So to keep this within a respectable time frame, I will not get to all of it, but as I was looking at the lessons, I wanted to first discuss Romans chapter 4. For those of you who are live, I will read it. When I was recording it, I would just ask you to pause it, but let me read it because it's important to have it read beforehand. A reminder to always have your Bible at a Bible study. I provide what the text is, but sometimes it's nice to look to see what comes before and after. So let's dig into Romans. Just as an introduction, Paul presents Abraham as an example for how a person comes into a right relationship with God, not through works of law, but through faith. Though Abraham and Sarah were far too old for bearing children, Abraham trusted that God would accomplish what God had promised to accomplish. So from Romans chapter 4, verses 13 through 25. The promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason, it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of all of us, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No, distrust him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now the words "it was reckoned to him" were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses and was raised for our justification. Just a moment of a little bit of levity. For those of you who are familiar with our building, as there are warmer days like this one, all the snow on the roof starts to slide and move. So if you hear this slamming, it's because the snow is melting today, which is quite wonderful. All right. Now, of course, you will want to also read the Genesis passage because that introduces Abraham. And so we have our lesson today from Romans, which Paul is picking up his deep knowledge of this promise that God made to Abraham. Okay, but we won't have time to dig into that too deeply. So there's an awful lot of really meaty stuff that I wanted to share. I did want to say a word of gratitude to the following biblical scholars for providing some of the resources, some of the information I am sharing. To Terrence Freithheim, Richard Carlson, and C. Clifton Black. So I appreciate their ministry of education. And as I do each Bible study, I'll grab some things that I read from them and then interweave some of my own observations and thoughts as well. So let's dig in. The overarching focus of Paul's letter to the Christian communities in Rome is the multifaceted nature of faith. Paul's call to bring about the obedience of faith literally bookends the letter. So what I want you to do is on a sheet of paper, I want you to mark down Romans chapter 1, verse 5, and then Romans 16:26. Because just as was said, there are bookends to this call to this obedience of faith. So Romans 1:5, Romans 16:26, and then after the study you can go back and see how Paul is actually addressing that. Throughout Romans, Paul declares that the gospel is the power of God whose goal is salvation for all who have faith. Jew first, and then the Greek. So mark down Romans 1:16. You can go back and research that yourself. The dynamics of a right relationship with God are revealed from God's faithfulness in order to bring forth our responses of faith. Mark down Romans 1:17. So this brings forth a response. And to seal his claims, Paul quotes Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, that the one who is righteous will live from faith. And that's in Romans 1:17, the second half of 17. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot of verses at you, but these things are good to know because then as we transition into Romans 4, we have some of these foundations that have been built. So Romans 4 can kind of build even further. So in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, through Romans chapter 3, verse 20, that whole section, Paul goes to great lengths to establish how God remains a faithful and righteous covenant partner, even though all humanity is in bondage to sin and under divine wrath. Next, Paul speaks of the cross, at once the act of Christ's faithfulness and the object of human faith, as the divine solution to humanity's helpless and hopeless dilemma. That's in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 31. Now, we all have crosses. We've seen crosses. Sometimes crosses turn into jewelry more than anything else. But as you wear your cross or you see others wear your cross, one of the things that I picked up through my preparation and study is that when I look at a cross now, I look at it as a divine solution to humanity's helpless and hopeless dilemma. I need not tell you your observations of humanity's helpless and hopeless dilemma. And I am sure that you've sat in your home over this last year and just said, how can people act that way? Or how can people do that to one another? Or, why can't we all sort of get along or agree on things? Well, it's because we are in a helpless and hopeless dilemma. But the cross is the solution to that dilemma. And I found that very helpful to me, that as I look at a cross now, that is a solution to a dilemma. And the dilemma, as we have discovered in our lives, is something that we cannot solve ourselves. I trust that many of you who are watching today are doers and fixers, and you want to make things right and well, right? And when those things don't happen, you are aghast that the world is not going along with how you think it should be fixed. Well, it's because it's beyond our ability. It doesn't mean we don't strive and try to make the world a better place, but at the end of the day, we are up against a helpless and hopeless dilemma. And so the cross is the solution to that. So, in Romans 4, so all that was an introduction to moving into Romans 4. Paul goes on to present Abraham as the human paradigm for living in the right covenant relationship, or i.e. righteousness. So we use the term righteousness. We want to develop that further by also naming it a right covenant relationship, okay, with God, because Abraham trusts or believes that God will fulfill God's promise. So mark down Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, because that is where the promise is. So you'll go back after the study, Romans 4, 1 through 5, and you'll see the promise. Indeed, Abraham is not just the human paradigm for faith and right relationships. Abraham is the forebearer for all, both the circumcised and the uncircumcised, who are to live in right covenant relationships with God, i.e. righteousness. Because the key to such a relationship is, drum roll please, faith. Mark down please, Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. So you'll notice that those verses come immediately before our passage for today, which picks up at 13. So go back and read these lead-ups. Now, our lesson today, or the text for Sunday, seeks to explain this fundamental and foundational claim regarding God's promise and Abraham's faith forming the contours of a right relationship. So, we have arrived at an explanation. And for those of us who like things explained, this is a good letter to study. So let's hear about the explanation. God's promise to Abraham and Abraham's descendants did not come through the law. Mark down Romans chapter 4, verse 13. For here, Paul builds on two prior points that he made regarding the law. First, knowledge of sin comes through the law. Mark down Romans chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. And therefore, the realization of God's wrath. Second, if Abraham's relationship with God were founded on Abraham's works, then Abraham would be in a position to boast about what he had achieved. But instead, he trusted in the promise that he had received. Mark down Romans chapter 4, verses 2 through 8. So consequently, any relationship with God which is grounded in and lives out of the law is not a right relationship. So that's kind of opposite, right? You would think a right relationship would be based upon us doing the law well. but that is not the case. Living out the law is not the basis of a right relationship with God. And in that situation, humans receive divine wrath rather than divine promise. So if we want to attach ourselves to the law and adhering to the law, then that will only bring about divine wrath, because if you are like me, you will never be able to fulfill the fullness of the law. If of the 10 commandments, you've heard this before, you break one of the commandments one time in your life, you have failed before the law. It's not like a do-over or a start over. You have failed. And you are not in a right covenantal relationship with God. It should be noted that most English translations, in the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is what we read from in the church, or the NIV, the New International Version, or the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, insert the word guarantee in verse 16. So write this down. Verse 16, if you have those three Bibles, you're going to see the word guarantee, which actually undercuts Paul's entire argument and could take us down the wrong road. So biblical scholar Rick Carlson, who actually was my New Testament professor and my Greek instructor, so I think of him fondly, Dr. Carlson says that Paul is writing about how the promise is firm and reliable rather than guaranteed. This is really insightful. Guarantees are matters of law, not of promise. So let's dig into that insight that Pastor and Dr. Carlson has provided for us today. His example is this. If a customer receives a guarantee on a purchase, they have entered into a contractual relationship with the seller. If the purchase does not live up to the terms of the guarantee, the seller is bound by the law to provide a repair, a replacement, or a refund. If not, the purchaser can take the seller to small claims court precisely because there is a law-based relationship. So Paul is arguing the exact opposite point when it comes to Abraham's relationship with God. It is not based on law, and so it is not a guarantee. It is based on what? This is when I wish you were here today. It is based on God's promise. Promise and guarantee are two different things. And without sort of that analysis by Dr. Carlson, I could have kind of merged those two things together to equate guarantee with promise. For us, that means that we cannot waive our baptismal certificates at the pearly gates and claim that we have been guaranteed eternal life. For Abraham, God's promise that he would be a father of many nations was not a guarantee. In fact, the divine promise flew in the face of all outward evidence when Abraham considered how his own body was as good as dead and the deadness of Sarah's womb. That's in 4:19. Abraham, this is really great. Abraham did not have a guarantee, but what did he have? He had a promise. When all evidence pointed to it can't happen, Abraham trusted in God's will. So this is what a right relationship with God for Abraham means. It was not a matter of legal claims or obligations or challenges, such as the stuff of the works for which Abraham would have received his rightful due. But throughout Romans chapter 4, a very rich chapter, the entire letter is just tremendously rich, Paul has rejected that as the nature and quality of the relational dynamics between God and Abraham. And instead, their right relationship is grounded in a gracious God who makes an incredible and at times seemingly unfulfillable promise to which Abraham responds by trusting that what God promises, God will accomplish. So I found that to be pretty insightful. I really appreciated digging more deeply into that. And so for us, we've heard this before, but this is where the justification by grace through faith flows out of. This very, I don't want to say a Lutheran, right? But I mean, Luther, of course, was the one who, this was that inspiration that he had. That we're in a right covenant relationship or justified, not through works, but it is by grace through faith. And this is where this letter from Paul really drives it home. Okay? All right. So I thought the second thing we'll cover, and probably the last to keep within a certain time frame, is our reading from Mark today, Mark chapter 8. This is where I'd pause to see if you had any questions or comments, but that's not to be today. So let me read it. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in glory of his Father with his holy angels." My throat is getting dry from all the talking today, drinking tea. Okay. So let's spend our remaining time digging into Mark's Gospel this afternoon. In Mark chapter 8, verse 29, so mark that down just before our lectionary. You'll have to go back and read it. Just a few verses ago, Simon Peter has tumbled to the truth about his teacher. "You are the Messiah." So, good job, Peter. But whatever glorious aspirations the 12 associated with that honorific, Jesus shuts them down in Mark 8:30, so just the verse before. And here's what it says: "By sternly ordering the disciples to not tell anyone about him." Now, that word, the Greek word behind our English words, sternly ordered, is a verb that is used elsewhere in Mark. And this is where studies of the Greek are really helpful, because when a writer is using certain words in many different places, it's not usually by happenstance. It's to make a theological point. It's also to connect other parts of the Bible with other parts of the Bible. So, as on a Sunday we would just sort of glance over that phrase, sternly ordered, we who are part of the Bible study will know more. So where else is that verb used, you may ask? Well, let me tell you. It is used in Mark for the silencing of the unclean spirits and the savage forces. So mark down chapter 1, verse 23, chapter 3, verse 12, and chapter 4, verse 39. So sternly ordering. So this is interesting. This is sort of the point that I'm making. Now, I guess before I say this, you can make too much of it, but I'd rather know more than not enough. So the point is this: the same verb that Jesus is using to speak against the unclean spirits and the savage forces, sternly ordered, is now being used to order the disciples. So you say to yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that as the disciples are speaking against Jesus, they are adhering to the unclean spirits and the savage forces. So see that profound that profound connection, right, that we have by, again, looking at what's underneath. What are those Greek words? And Professor Carlson. I appreciate him for guiding me through that for those many years. In Mark 8:31, the first verse of our study for today, Jesus shifts to what the Son of Man must endure by the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. But after the full measure of this fatal disgrace has been exacted, he will rise again after 3 days. Now, none of this is accidental. So as we're in Lent and we're going to move into Holy Week, one of the important things to know and to remember is that all of this passion narrative, Holy Week into death, crucifixion, death, resurrection, ascension, this is all part of this divine plan. The Son of Man must undergo all this by God's design. Now, must undergo, or must, the word behind must is the Greek word day. And day is thought to be, because what? Deo, right? Deo. Day is a divine imperative. It is something that is not by happenstance, right? That Jesus just decided to go to Jerusalem, and then he was speaking out against the leaders, and then he just happened to get himself crucified. And then, but because he's the Son of God, he's then raised, right? So, I mean, I'm pretty sure we knew that. But it's good to know that there are several parts within the Gospels where you see this word day, must. It is a divine imperative. It is an action that is brought about by God. And nothing will stop that. Not our foolishness, not our invasion, not our stupidity, nothing like that. But, of course, Peter and us will have none of it. Mark 8:32, the second half. Taking Jesus aside, Peter rebukes him. Now, the Greek word behind rebuke, a much better, more honest translation is an imperative, shut up. So I want you, we've all used that word before, kids and parents, shut up, exclamation point. So it's more than just a rebuke. He's telling them to shut up. So I think that adds a depth to the text, right? It's a pretty harsh verb. Same one in 8:30. Regarding all his disciples, Jesus lashes back at them. He rebukes them. So he even says, shut up. So we got this sort of like a spat. Well, it's more than a spat. It's some serious rebuking. It's some serious shutting upping going on. I just made up a word there. Now, Jesus puts him and all his followers back to their proper place. So after the shut-ups, then Jesus says in a very imperative way, get behind me. Get behind me, Satan. Now remember, as we began, this sternly ordering was the verb that Mark uses to speak against the unclean spirits. So, as we're going to see later, when we are speaking out against this day, this necessary thing, then we are aligning ourselves with the evil spirits. And we will be told to shut up about that, because it's going to happen. Now, Peter is the only figure in Mark whom Jesus addresses so passionately. Poor Peter. And so, the question would be, well, why? Why Peter? Well, here's why. And this affirms the point that I made about the reason that we get rebuked. We get rebuked or called Satan. Mark 8:33, the second half of 33. Here's the quote. Have this memorized. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Just think, how Orthodox Jews will wear, and I forget the name, speaking off the cuff here, but they have something attached to them, and in that is God's word, right? It's what they need to remember, right? It might even be the Shema, love the Lord your God. But anyway, so my point is that, can you imagine if we had attached that sentence to somewhere on us, like inside of our glasses or on our ear, I don't know. And every time that we were going to open our mouths or make a decision, that phrase jumps up. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Like every time we're ready to kind of do something that is dumb or not worth it or a waste of time, that is sort of the billboard. So that won't happen, but you as Bible study participants will at least know that power of the verse and perhaps write it on your hand. I don't know. You'll figure it out. So Peter has moved himself as an authority to an authority that's not his position to wield, as in fact devilish. So it might seem strong, but this is what we have to study, that as we are speaking out or doing against Jesus, we're acting devilish. So this is no sort of mild disagreement between Satan or between Peter and Jesus. Mark, and this is a really important part of this, what it is that we're talking about, what Jesus is talking to Peter, is really about life and death. This is a clash between the divine and the not divine. This is life and death stuff. Now that sounds rather threatening and maybe an overdramatic statement, but listen, bad things happen to us. I know that even when we're trying to do everything right? I mean, there's things that just happen. But there's often a good part of things that happen to us brought on by ourselves, brought on by our arrogance, by whatever. And before you know it, we can be found and find ourselves in one of those life and death situations. So I don't think it is being overly dramatic. I think that's what is at stake here. And Jesus wants Peter to understand this is not a mild disagreement that we can kind of agree to disagree. Jesus is laying it down and saying no. That you move over to the devil, to those evil spirits, when you're setting your mind on human things. Jesus opens his teaching beyond the 12 to the overhearing the crowd, including, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And so even more closely, we have this very sharp, where it says life, that English word life, lose their life, the Greek word behind it is psyche. And we know for the English, psyche, but the soul, psychology, right? So lose not just your breathing life, but you lose your soul. So as I close out here, because I'm trying to keep it within a time frame because there's an issue with uploading if it's too long. So I'm really trying to be cognizant of time. But I was really thinking about doing what is right and also what is wrong. And, the part that I want to end with in terms of Mark's gospel, let me go back, that I really resonated with was, of course I can't find it right in front of me. In verse 36, for what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? I see it, we see it all the time. People pursuing human things in such an aggressive way that, they're led down these paths, and then before you know it, their whole life is completely blown up. And I often think, gosh, if I just pray that doesn't happen to me. I mean, I'm not that arrogant to think that it couldn't. But they've just lost everything. And for what? I mean, maybe they had some more money, they were able to buy a beach house or a car, I don't know. But I mean, is that worth it? To be incarcerated or lose your family, lose friendships, lose the honor of your name? These things are priceless things. And so this is why what Jesus is sharing with us this upcoming Sunday is a matter of life and death. And I'd like to really for us to consider that and as we make decisions in life to think of this passage. All right, well, this was enjoyable, different. It's nice to be in the church rather than out of my office. So we will do this another 4 times. And for those of you who are watching it in the evening, I'm glad this will be available for whenever it's convenient to you. So thank you for your continued support of this ministry. Please continue to be in prayer and hang in there. Bye-bye.